Hi everyone, this is Celine from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to the video 5 for the Honeysuckle Hobo bag. This will probably be the longest video in the series because we're going to complete the assembly of our bag. I'm going to change the order a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead to, I think it's step 45, where we sew up our O-ring connectors. So if you want to get your 1.5 inch O-rings or D-rings, if you've chosen to use D-rings instead, and your O-ring connectors. So we will start by drawing a line down the center on the wrong side of each connector. Would be nice if my pen worked. Now, if you're using fabric, your steps will be slightly different here. I'm using cork, so I can't press it. Okay, so what we need to do next is we need to have these edges come in towards the center line that we just drew on the wrong side. So if you're using fabric, you'll go over to your ironing board and you'll press both halves in towards the center like so. If, like me, you're using cork or vinyl, you're going to go over to your machine and you're going to fold it in as you would if you were using fabric, but you're going to sew at the same time to sew it in place, and you're going to do it along both sides of that center line for both of the connector pieces. Okay, so I've sewn both of the connectors, and I don't know if you can see, there's a bit of a shadow here. So I've actually sewn the strap down in place along both sides of that center line, and there are your raw edges there in the center. So now you'll take your ring and you'll pass the strap through the ring, fold the ring in half so that the raw edges are together. I'm just going to use a clip. And you're going to go over to your machine and you're going to sew the strap together. You'll start at the bottom raw edge and go up towards your O-ring, then sew across and then sew down. And you're going to do this for both of your connectors. Okay, now you're using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance when you're on the sides, sewing along the sides, and you'll want to try and sew as close as you can to your O-ring, but make sure that you don't go so close that you can't rotate the strap piece under the foot of your machine. Okay, so both connectors are sewn up. I'm going to just set them aside for now, and we'll take the shoulder strap and complete our shoulder strap. Now again, I'm changing the order of the steps, so this is the last step in your pattern. And the steps are actually quite similar. You're going to draw a line on the wrong side through the center horizontally. So it should be 1.5 inches. In the center is 1.5 inches. Okay, now we're not going to go straight to the machine and fold in half and sew in place. Before we do that, we're actually going to pass both of the swivels, pass the strap through the swivels before we do that. Now for now they can be together, it doesn't matter. And it also really doesn't matter at this point which direction they're facing. Okay. And now, making sure that your strap isn't twisted, you're going to bring the shorter ends together, right sides together, and we're just going to clip them. And then we're going to go over to our machine and we're going to sew these together. So I want you to sew these shorter ends together. You can use 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's not that important. And then we're going to open up the seam allowance and we're going to top stitch along both sides. So if you're using fabric, again, you're going to sew, press the seam allowance, open, and then top stitch along both sides. If you're using cork or vinyl like I am, you'll just finger press the seam allowance open and sew along both sides. Okay, so here are the shorter ends sewn together and the seam allowance has been top stitched open. So now we have a loop and we have our straps together. So now we're going to do the same thing as we did for the strap connectors, and we're going to fold and sew both halves in towards that center line. Now if you're using fabric, again, you're going to press and then sew. If you're using vinyl or cork, you're going to have to fold and sew at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this together both sides, and then when I come back I'll show you the final step to sewing the strap. Alright, so I've sewn both halves of my strap in towards that center line. There's the raw edges. Now if the clasp part of your swivel is on the same side as the raw edges, you're going to rotate them so that they are pointing away. So they should be on the finished side of the strap. Do that for both of them. Okay, and then I want them at opposite ends of the loop, like so. Now pay attention to where your seam is. I'm going to put it close to one of the swivels, one of the rings of the swivels, but I want it inside enough where I'm going to, when I sew in the next step, that the seam is inside of that additional seam that I'm going to sew. So flatten the loop, okay, raw edges are in the middle, clip in place, okay. So now I'm going to go over to my machine and I will sew all the way around. So when you're sewing along these edges, you'll sew with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you're sewing across underneath one of the rings of your swivels up to the other side, sew down. So what you're really sewing is a giant rectangle box of stitching, and that seam where you join the shorter ends of the strap piece should be inside of that rectangle of stitching, but you can place it close to one of the rings of the swivels. Okay, so the shoulder strap is finished, and if you want, you can actually you can add some rivets on here if you want. I'm just going to set this aside for now, and I'll gather my my pieces for the next step. Okay, the next thing we're going to sew is the zipper panels. What you'll need are your 2 exterior zipper panel pieces, your 20-inch zipper, and your 2 zipper panel lining pieces. So what we will need to start is one of your lining pieces and your 20-inch zipper. So one thing that I want to mention that's different from the diagrams in the pattern is that in the diagrams the zipper is actually shorter than the zipper panels. Now I had to do that in the diagrams because otherwise, as you can see here, you can't even see the zipper panels, so it would make the diagrams confusing. So yes, your zipper should be longer than your zipper panels. If that's what you have, then that is correct. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pin my zipper to my zipper panel, and then I'm going to just quickly baste in place along this edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now you don't have to worry too much about precision in this step. It's the next step where you're going to want to be very, very precise when you're sewing your exterior zipper panel. Okay, so for now, just go over to your machine and baste these in place with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along this edge. So I've used contrasting thread color so you can see the basting stitches here. And there's my attached lining piece. So leave this on your work surface like this with the stitching at the top, and take one of your exterior zipper panel pieces, and I want it to be right sides together with the zipper. Now here's the part where you need to be very precise. So I want these shorter ends of the lining and the exterior zipper panel pieces to be lined up perfectly. If they're not lined up perfectly, you're really going to struggle when you're sewing up the top corners of your bag. So what I do is I actually pin both ends first, and then I pin everything in between. And then I'm going to go over to my machine and sew them together, but this time I will sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're sewing on the same side as your basting stitches, okay? And once they're sewn together, we'll press them away from the zipper and we'll top stitch the seam allowance. Okay, so I've sewn the exterior zipper panel in place. Now, if while you're sewing you notice that your exterior zipper panel is longer than your lining panel, you can trim it before you finish sewing it in place to make sure that they're exactly the same length. Okay, so I'm going to, I'll set up my ironing pad and I'll press this away from the zipper and then top stitch it. Okay, so I am going to press this away from the zipper. Turn it over and press the lining away from the zipper as well. If you're using zipper tape like I am, I recommend just doing some quick basting stitches at the very end so that you don't accidentally pull off your zipper pull while you're working on the zipper panel assembly. It can happen. I've done it myself many times. Okay. So in this step, when you're pressing away, you want to make sure that your edges here, the raw edges along this longer side, are aligned, so you want them to meet at the raw ends. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm just going to top stitch the seam allowance here along the zipper. Okay, so I've top stitched along the zipper. I actually took slightly smaller than 1/8 of an inch seam allowance because I want as much of the zipper panels as possible to be free for when we attach the main panels of the bag. It'll make it a bit easier. I'm just going to pull this down. And now you're going to take your remaining lining zipper panel, and we're going to repeat the two previous steps. So here again, you want these to line up perfectly. So I start by lining up these shorter edges here. So I want the shorter edge of the zipper panel to line up with this, the shorter edge of the attached zipper panels. And again, you start by basting this lining panel in place and then sewing the exterior zipper panel. So you're repeating exactly the same 2 steps we've just completed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so the zipper panel is assembled. Now I need to mark my centers. So you're going to fold it in half so that these shorter ends of your zipper panels meet. Okay, and then you're going to mark the center, but you need to mark it on the wrong side. If you find this folding part to be a bit tricky because you don't want to bend your zipper teeth too sharply, you can just measure the center and mark it that way. Okay, so I just make some very faint marks and then I make them a bit darker. So you want that on the wrong side of the zipper, the exterior and the lining zipper panels. And also make sure that they're lined this way. So okay, so your center marks are 9 1/8 from one end. So if you measure 9 1/8, then you'll have your center. So now we're going to assemble, we're going to attach the lining panels and the exterior panels to these zipper panels. So I'm going to get my panels ready and I'll show you how to attach them to the zipper panel. So we're going to start by attaching the 2 lining panels to the zipper lining panels. So I will just take the 1 panel to start. And you remember we made the center marks on the wrong side at the top of your lining panels. So you will start by aligning that center mark with the center mark we just made on the zipper panel. And you're clipping these right sides together, only the lining, so see the exterior zipper panel is free. And you start by clipping the center mark, and then you clip the rest. So you go from the center out when you're clipping in this step. Now your I'm gonna pull a little bit extra here. Now your zipper panel will probably curve, following the curve of the top edge of the lining panel. That's fine. Okay, and it's going to look something like this when you get to the end here. Just put 1 extra clip. Okay, and then now I'm going to clip the other side. Again, start from the center and work your way to the top corners. And then we're going to sew these together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to go over to my machine and sew these together. Now make sure that you're pushing your exterior zipper panel out of the way. You're only sewing the lining zipper panel to the top edge of the lining panel. Okay, so the lining panel is sewn to the lining zipper panel, and I'm just going to clip a bit in the seam allowance here along the curve. Make sure you don't clip too close to your stitching. Okay. And then you want to press the seam allowance towards the zipper. So it's a bit awkward because of the curve, but just go slowly and adjust as needed. Okay, and then you'll go over to your machine and you will top stitch this seam allowance. So here the seam allowance is pressed towards the zipper, and you're just going to top stitch here along this seam the whole way. Okay, so I've finished the top stitching. You'll see there's the top stitching line right here. I use some ugly contrasting thread so you could actually see it better. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the remaining lining panel, and I'm going to attach it to this edge of the remaining zipper panel lining piece. So I'm not going to show you all those steps all over again. Just do the same thing and attach, sew together, and then do the top stitching. So both main lining panels are attached to the zipper panels. So here's a view from the side of the lining, and it should curve. It should have a curve this way. So now we're going to flip this over, and we're going to do exactly the same thing, but we're going to attach our exterior panels to the exterior zipper panels. Now, it will be a bit annoying because your lining panels will try to get in the way, but we're doing exactly the same thing as we did for the lining panels. You're attaching right sides together by aligning the center marks first. You clip along the entire length, starting from the center, working to the top corners, and then you're going to sew them together, clip the seam allowance, and top stitch. And you're going to top stitch exactly the same way. The seam allowance is pressed in towards the zipper, and then you top stitch the seam allowance. So it's going to look exactly as it does for the lining, except it'll be your exterior panels. So I'm going to go ahead and attach both of my exterior panels. Pay attention as well to where your zipper pull is located. So if you want your bag to open in a certain direction, make sure that you're attaching your front panel in the right position. So here I'm actually going to, I prefer my bag to open the other way. So when you're attaching, going to attach and then flip. So once this is sewn together, it's going to be flipped in this direction. So I have my exterior front zipper over to this side, and my bag is going to open in this direction. So make sure that you're paying attention to this when you're attaching your exterior panels if you do have a preference. So I'm going to go ahead and attach both of my exterior panels, and then we will sew on our lining and exterior gussets. Have both exterior panels attached to my zipper panels, and the same with my lining panels. So we're going to attach the O-ring connectors, but first what I'd like to do is trim my zipper so that it's even with the edges of my zipper panel, and then I'm going to seal the edges. I'm going to do that for both sides. Now here, actually, I'm going to go and base stitch this at my machine because I base stitched too far. So I'm going to baste stitch actually at both ends, and then I'll come finish cutting. Okay, basted the zipper at both ends. I'll just finish trimming. Okay. Now you're going to, so make sure your zipper is out of the way. You're going to clip your ring and align the edge with the these ends of the ends of your zipper panel. And then you're going to go over to the machine. Now make sure it's also centered here. So you want the teeth of your zipper to be directly in the center of this connector strap. Okay, right. And I'll do the same for the other. Now when you're basting, okay, make sure that this is open, and yes, you are basting through all the layers. So you're basting through the exterior and the lining zipper panels when you're basting these in place. Okay, so I'm going to go baste those in place, and then we'll attach our gussets. So the O-ring connectors are basted at each end of my zipper. I'm going to open my zipper halfway or a little bit more. Place it on your work surface, right like this, with the front of the bag showing. And then take your exterior gusset, and you want your gusset zipper to be on your left. And then flip it and line up the center marks of the gusset bottom with the center mark at the bottom of your exterior panel. And you're going to start by clipping those center marks together. So you want your gusset and your exterior to be right sides together. So start by clipping the bottom. And make sure that you're only clipping the exterior, so your lining pieces should remain unattached. I'm going to turn it around this way. And then clip your top corners together. So the top edge of your gusset is attached to the top corner of your exterior panel. And then clip everything in between. Take your time, use a lot of clips. I'm actually going to turn this way because I want the gusset to follow the curve of the bottom edge of my zipper panel. And then you're just going to sew these together. And then you'll do the same to sew together the second exterior panel to the other side of your gusset. Okay, and then I do the same on this side. Clip the corner, and then I clip everything in between. Hopefully you can see all of the bag. It is a large bag, so it's a bit difficult to get it all on camera, but hopefully you can see it. Okay, so you're going to go over to your machine, you're going to sew these together. Make sure that you backstitch at the top corners here where you begin and end the seam. And then you're going to repeat this to sew the other exterior panel and both lining panels. You're going to sew those to your gusset to these panels here. Now you're going to take a different seam allowance when you're sewing the lining panels, but I'll show you that when we get to that point. Okay, so I'm going over to my machine now, and I'll start at one corner, back stitch, sew all the way around, and then back stitch when I get to the other corner. So I've gone ahead and sewn the gusset to both of my exterior panels. I'm just going to show you a view from all sides. I mentioned this in my bellflower video series, but when I'm sewing my exteriors together, I always sew twice. 2 lines of stitching, very short distance apart, maybe a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch. And I always do that when I do the exterior assembly. Now I started pinning the lining gusset to one of my lining panels. So you're doing exactly the same as you did for your exterior panels. One thing before you completely attach your gusset, make sure that your interior zipper pocket is open all the way. And again, just confirm that you've opened the main zipper of your bag. Make sure that it's open at least halfway. Now, I'm going to finish clipping the one side of the gusset to one of your lining panels. And what you're going to do, you're going to sew it exactly as you did for the exterior, with one difference. You're going to change the seam allowance when you're sewing the lining, because we don't want the lining of the bag to be baggy inside. So when you start at the top corner here, you start at your regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But as you start sewing down the sides, increase your seam allowance to 1/2 an inch or even 5/8 of an inch. You can try 1/2 an inch, and if it's still a bit baggy, try 5/8 of an inch. So you increase your seam allowance along this portion, but then when you return to the top corner, just make sure that you're once again using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's because we want everything to line up here at the top corner of your bag. So I'm going to pause the video. I'll finish clipping and sewing my lining pieces. So I finished trimming the seam allowance on all 4 seams. Just going to throw this out. And the final step is just to sew up our corners, and it's fairly simple. You're just going to flatten all the layers. Now, hopefully, if you're using a domestic machine and you're not really sure if it can get through all of these layers, hopefully you followed my recommendations and you removed the fleece interfacing at the top corners of these pieces. If not, you might have a little bit of trouble getting through all the layers if you're using a domestic machine. There's a few things you can try. I've heard of hammering on the seams to flatten them. Also, you can just, hand crank the machine if you want, if you're afraid of breaking a needle. My machine is pretty strong, so it won't have any issues, but for those of you who are concerned, those are a couple of things that you can try. So I'm just trying to flatten all the layers right now. And you want to just make sure that your zipper is centered between that connector strap. Now I'm going to go over to my machine, and I'm actually going to sew through all these layers. And I'm going to sew more than once because I want the connector to be well sewn in, because that's where all the weight of the bag will be carried. So just make sure that you're sewing more than once. Even like 3 seams would be a great idea, separated by a small amount of space, similar to what I did for the exterior seams here of the exterior panel gusset seams. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to my machine and sew these layers together now. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the other corner of the bag. And then I'm going to turn my bag right side out through the opening that I left at the bottom of the zipper pocket. Okay, so I've sewn both both top corners where I have my strap connectors. I don't know if you can see, but I did sew more than once. So now I'm just going to reach in through the opening at the bottom of my zipper pocket and turn my bag right side out. I always start with the bottom because that's always the most difficult part of turning a bag, just because you have that the firm interfacing in the bottom. Okay. Okay, now before you close up the bottom, I just like to push out all the seams, all the corners. Obviously I'm going to need to press my bag. Also note I did not trim the seam allowance at my top corners where I have my connectors. I don't want to weaken that area. Okay, so now all we have to do is sew up the bottom of our zipper pocket and press the bag, and then we just have to attach our strap. So I'll just tuck this in for now. I'm not going to press it. I'm going to get my mini iron and press it after. But once you've sewn up your zipper pocket, you just have to attach your shoulder strap and then zip up the bag, and we're done.